The screen fades in from black. A warm, flickering candle glow plays across worn stone. Wind whistles faintly through an unseen corridor, carrying with it the breath of a world long gone. The voice that enters is soft, calm, like a whisper from a shadow leaning close. Welcome, weary traveler. You found your way here, perhaps by chance, perhaps by need. Whatever the reason, you're among kindred souls now, seekers of forgotten echoes, listeners to the hush of time itself. Dim the lights, turn on a fan. Maybe lie back. Or just let your eyes rest. Let me know, if you feel like it, where in the world you are tonight. Are you curled beneath a blanket, listening as the stars turn silently overhead? Or stealing a quiet moment between the noise of the day? Wherever you are, whenever you are, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we journey to the banks of the Nile. Not the postcard Nile. Not the tour-guided temples or the golden masks of museum glass, but deeper into a darker Egypt. An Egypt ruled by gods in human form. Pharaohs whose hearts were iron and whose mercy was as rare as rain. There were rulers who built with stone and dreams. And then there were those who built with bones, whose legacy was etched not in sunlight but in suffering. These are their stories. The cruelest of kings, the godmen whose thirst for power blurred the line between ruler and monster. What made them this way? Was it the divine right, the unbearable weight of being a living god? Was it the solitude at the top, or the paranoia, the endless need to crush dissent before it was born, or was it something darker still? Let's begin and let the Nile carry us backward, slowly, gently, until we arrive in a time where history begins to bleed. The air is thick with heat. The desert sings its quiet, eternal song, and in the cradle of the first dynasty a man named Yer takes the throne. He wasn't born with the luxury of legends. No pyramids rose for him yet. No towering temples bore his name. Yer stood at the beginning, the third pharaoh of a still fragile, newly unified Egypt, a land of tribes stitched together by ambition and war. The gods had not yet whispered the full extent of their power into the ears of kings, but Yer was listening. And he heard something no man should. That to become immortal, one must be feared before one is loved. History remembers little of Yer. The sands have swallowed most of his story, but what fragments remain are soaked in dread. He was a unifier, yes, but his methods left scars across the land. Rival chieftains were not defeated. They were obliterated. Their villages were not conquered, they were erased. There is a legend whispered, not written, that after one particularly merciless campaign, Yer stood atop a hill, his shadow long in the dusk, and ordered the severed hands of every enemy soldier gathered before him. Not heads, not weapons, hands. Imagine the horror of it. The Nile winds nearby, silent and indifferent. The sun glares down with godlike cruelty, and at Yer's feet, a mountain of hands, pale, blood-slicked, lifeless fingers splayed in the dust, a grotesque monument to obedience, a message carved not in stone, but in flesh. This is what disobedience costs, and those weren't his enemies, even his own servants were not spared. For Yer, death was not merely a tool, it was currency. A way to buy eternity. To walk into the afterlife surrounded by the souls of those who served him. He is said to have ordered the sacrifice of loyal servants at his death, not in grief, but in expectation. Their task, it seemed, was not yet done. Not even in death. What kind of mind believes that love can follow a man into the grave only through slaughter? What kind of king counts souls like possessions? Yer believed it made him stronger. Perhaps he believed it made him divine. But it made him a blueprint. He became a dark seed planted in Egyptian soil. From him grew a lineage of fear, a long line of pharaohs who learned that power is sharpest when it cuts without hesitation. Yer's monuments are long gone. His name barely clings to the edges of record. But the dread he inspired ripples still, a shadow stretching forward through centuries. The desert was quiet, but it remembered. Beneath its wind-swept skin lay the bones of an empire, and among them, the first whispers of a name that would haunt Egypt's early memory. Yer. He ruled when the land was young. A time before the grandeur, before the towering pyramids cast their long shadows. Egypt was still learning to be a kingdom, still tasting the blood that would bind upper and lower lands together, and Yer made sure it learned it through pain. He was the third ruler of the first dynasty. A pharaoh not yet swaddled in gold and myth, but hardened by the raw need to survive and dominate. In this newly forged kingdom, peace wasn't inherited, it was seized, and Yer was not a man to hesitate. His enemies were not simply defeated, they were erased. Entire factions vanished beneath the swing of his soldiers' blades. But it wasn't the scale of his warfare that chilled the bones of history. It was the message he left behind. One tale, half lost in time and half whispered through tomb walls, speaks of a battlefield littered with the severed hands of Jur's fallen enemies. Not bodies, not heads, hands, cut clean and piled like offerings. Some believe it was to count the dead, others, to humiliate the vanquished, to ensure that even in death, they were robbed of power. But in the hot, buzzing silence of a blood-soaked plain, those hands became something else, a monument of flesh. A grotesque reminder, resist, and this is what remains of you. Anjur was not finished with the living. He ruled not just over the lands and the courts, but over death itself, or so he believed. Like many early pharaohs, he prepared obsessively for the afterlife, surrounding himself with treasures and servants who would accompany him beyond the grave. But Jur's servants were not statues. They were people, flesh and breath and fear. And when he died, many of them were buried beside him, not in tribute, but as sacrifice. Imagine the terror, a servant, plucked from the palace halls, wrapped in linen not for healing, but for burial. Their final breath taken beneath the weight of ritual. Their only crime, loyalty to a god-king who believed his soul needed company. Was it devotion? Was it command? Or was it cruelty disguised as piety? This was not rare in Egypt's early dynasties, but Jur is remembered for the scale of it, for the coldness with which he turned funerals into slaughter. His tomb at Abydos is vast, lined with the graves of those who died so he would not journey alone into the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. To him, they were tools, extensions of his will, even in death, and yet, the sands do not lie easily over tyrants. Centuries later, his tomb would be desecrated, reinterpreted, absorbed into the cult of Osiris, as though the people themselves were trying to overwrite the memory of who he truly was. Perhaps they entered, perhaps they needed to, but history has a way of bleeding back through the cracks. Jur's rule carved something permanent into the soul of Egypt. He was not the last cruel pharaoh, not by far, but he was the mold. The one who showed what could be done when power had no limits. He unified through fear, ruled through death, and left behind a silence so heavy, it still hums in the stones of Abydos. As the stars passed over the desert night, the people of Egypt learned to walk lightly in the presence of gods made flesh. Anjur, the silent butcher, watched from beneath his tomb. Still surrounded by the voices of those who never chose to follow him into the dark. The wind sweeps across the valley once more, stirring the dust that has settled over centuries. Temples lie broken, inscriptions half swallowed by time. But if you press your ear to the stones, if you truly listen, you may still hear the echo of footsteps stop, the cautious steps of servants, the hurried pace of scribes, the heavy, deliberate march of executioners, and somewhere among them, a name rises again. A name that would carve itself into the heart of Egypt's early old kingdom. Khacemwy. He came at the end of chaos, or perhaps, he was the chaos ending in flesh. Egypt, then, was a land divided once again. The two regions, upper and lower, had erupted in civil war, brothers against brothers. Cities burned, blood ran through canals once meant to carry life. For a time, no one ruled both lands. The very idea of divine kingship teetered on the edge of ruin. And then came Khacemwy. His name, roughly translated, means the powerful one arises, or, as some have dared to interpret, the one who strikes both sides into peace. But it was peace born of terror. He claimed the throne with a sword in one hand and flame in the other. His rise was not peaceful, it was brutal, decisive, and deliberate. Cities that resisted were flattened, leaders who stood against him were broken before their people. Inscriptions from the time, written with a chilling pride, claim that Khacemwy ordered the execution of over 47,000 rebels. A number likely exaggerated, yes, but the intent behind the boast is clear. He wanted Egypt to remember what resistance cost. Imagine it. A courtyard soaked in the heat of the sun, lined with kneeling prisoners. High above, the pharaoh watches, wrapped in linen and stone, unmoved, unreadable. Below him, one by one, the condemned are struck down. Their blood darkens the earth, their names vanish forever. And the message is sent across the land. Egypt belongs to one voice now. One God. One King. Khacemwy. He ordered the construction of massive stone enclosures, strange, looming structures built not for worship, but for power. For presence. Their sheer scale was unlike anything seen before. These were not temples for gods, they were monuments to himself. They cast long shadows across the desert floor, as if to say, here ends the age of division. Here stands the hand that silenced a kingdom. But cruelty does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Kasekemwi understood the art of spectacle. His monuments were not just built, they were calculated. Built at sacred sites, aligned with cosmic forces. He wove fear into religion, embedded his name into creation itself. And then he did something extraordinary, something that confused historians for generations. He changed his name. He began his reign as Kasekum, but after solidifying his rule over both Upper and Lower Egypt, he added way to his name, making it Kasekemwi. It was a symbol of duality, of unity forged in blood. But it was also a warning. I have seen both sides. I have crushed both sides. I am now greater than both. Even his statues, those stone effigies left to guard his legacy, tell a quiet story of conquest. He sits with the white crown of Upper Egypt, the tall, narrow helm of the south. Yet his name is carved with the symbols of both lands, a crocodile beneath two flowers. Two hawks perched upon a seraph, the ancient palace facade that framed royal names. These were not idle decorations. These were declarations. I have tamed chaos. I have bound the Nile. I am the first and the last word. And yet, for all the power he wielded, Kasekemwi remains a ghost. His story is broken, fragmented. Many of his inscriptions were deliberately defaced in later dynasties. Some believe it was an attempt to forget his brutal unification. Others think it was fear. Fear that his memory alone might summon tyranny once more. His tomb, hidden in the cliffs of Abydos, was vast. Its corridors ran deep, like veins dug into the flesh of the earth. Within, stone vessels and shattered seals bear his name. And the bones of sacrificed attendants lie curled in dark corners, their mouths forever sealed by dust. Did he believe they would serve him in death? Did they go willingly? Or did the silence speak louder than the chants? No one knows. But the echoes remain. Kasekemwi was perhaps the last pharaoh of the second dynasty, but in many ways, he was the first true architect of what pharaohs would become. He fused brutality with divinity. He made death a spectacle and conquest a holy rite. And he proved, perhaps most dangerously of all, that cruelty when wrapped in ritual could become sacred. In the stillness of the night, his monuments still stand. Cracked, weather-worn, but defiant. They whisper of a man who took a shattered land and molded it with fists, with flame, and with fear. A man who ruled not only the living but tried to command the dead. And as the Nile rolls on in moonlight, washing against the stones he left behind, we are left with one question. If power can create peace, what must it destroy? The desert air grows heavier now, like breath held too long. The wind no longer dances, it drags. And through the suffocating silence of time, we step into the shadow of a new ruler. One whose ambition dwarfed even the cruelty of his predecessors, Sneferu. To many, he is remembered as a builder, a visionary of stone. The first great pyramid architect, the father of Egypt's age of grandeur. His name still echoes from the limestone walls of Medum and Dashur. Historians often speak of him with admiration, as a pharaoh who turned engineering into religion. But behind every polished facade lies the hidden cost of beauty, behind every monument, blood. Sneferu was the first king of Egypt's fourth dynasty. His reign began with promises of order and prosperity, but quickly became a machine of unrelenting labor. He sought to build what no other king had, a perfect pyramid, not once, but again and again. His obsession consumed the kingdom, stretching its people and resources thin, demanding thousands of lives for each structure. They say he was beloved, that he was a good king, but what does goodness mean when it comes from the mouth of the king's own scribes? What does kindness look like when the sun burns the skin of men who will never be remembered? Imagine the quarries. Massive scars carved into the earth, men dragging stone blocks heavier than oxen. Their bodies whipped forward with cracked leather and cruel hands. No shade. No rest. Only the rhythm of suffering, the chant of forced unity. Lift, pull, bleed, obey. They weren't soldiers. They weren't criminals. Many were farmers, their hands more used to wheat than stone. But under Sneferu, they became instruments of his will, bent into servitude by royal decree. Entire villages were emptied to feed the workforce. Crops left unharvested. Children left behind. Why? Because the god king dreamed in triangles. The first pyramid, at Meedum, rose awkwardly, a strange, broken tower. A miscalculation. It collapsed, partially, killing many who worked on it. But the failure didn't stop him, it inflamed him. What was death, compared to legacy? The second attempt, the bent pyramid, still stands, its sides curving in strange submission, as though even the stone itself feared his hunger for perfection. And then came the red pyramid, wide, smooth, majestic. A monument to ego as much as vision. But it was not built with magic. It was built with the backs of thousands, their lives spent stone by stone. No records speak of their names. No tombs mark their passing, just dust and exhaustion. And the silence that follows a scream long since swallowed. Sneferu's cruelty was not loud. It did not wear a sword at its side, it smiled, it promised glory. It hid behind the illusion of peace. But peace forged in the crushing of human will is no peace at all. It is obedience dressed in gold. Some inscriptions praise him as a bringer of joy, a ruler who filled Egypt's granaries and temples. But do the hungry praise the feast of kings? Or do they merely pretend because pretending is safer than dissent? Even in death his reach endured. His tomb, hidden within the heart of the Red Pyramid, was carved with obsessive detail. Every chamber, every passage, measured to sacred proportions. A puzzle of stone meant to guarantee his resurrection. Yet his body has never been found. Perhaps he was buried elsewhere, or perhaps the gods denied him, because even gods tire of ambition disguised as divinity. In the myths, a pharaoh becomes immortal through through balance, truth, harmony. But Sneferu unbalanced a nation in his pursuit of timelessness. He silenced truth beneath blocks of stone. He called it harmony, and the world obeyed. Until the dust told another story. Beneath the desert moon, his pyramids still rise like mountains. Still, cold, perfect. And beneath them, in soil no longer red but gray with the bones of the forgotten, the question lingers. What price did Egypt pay for eternity? And did anyone count the cost? The night deepens. The wind grows dry and sharp, slicing across the sands like memory itself, ancient, bitter, unrelenting. Out here, silence speaks louder than words. And in that silence, another name rises from the dark. A name that stirs unease even among those who've long forgotten its meaning. Khufu. The world remembers him for one thing: the Great Pyramid of Giza, the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. A marvel of architecture, a symbol of eternity. A crown of stone laid upon the brow of Egypt by a king who saw himself as more than human. But monuments lie. Or at least, they don't speak of suffering. Khufu, known also as Cheops by the Greeks, did not rule gently. The grandeur of his legacy casts a long shadow, and in that shadow, people disappeared. Some historians try to soften him, to argue over translations, to paint him as a mysterious enigma. But the ancient Egyptians told a different tale, a tale of cruelty. The West Car Papyrus, a fragment of story passed down generations, describes him not as a benevolent ruler, but as a cold, calculating man. One who summoned magicians not to learn, but to manipulate. One who ordered women brought to him to be used, to perform tricks and dances for his pleasure. A ruler whose curiosity veiled something far darker, the desire to control even the unknowable. His pyramid was no mere tomb, it was a statement. A declaration of absolute dominion over death, over the cosmos, over his people. It demanded a workforce in the tens of thousands. Some say they were not slaves. They call them laborers, conscripts, craftsmen. But whether chained or ordered, the weight on their backs was the same. Year after year, stone upon stone, they built his name into the sky. Under a sun that boiled the flesh, in wines that skinned the lips to bleeding. Their homes were camps, their tools bone and copper. Their payment, bread, onions, and silence. What kind of man demands a mountain for his bones? What kind of god orders the Nile to bend to his vanity? Khufu rarely showed himself to the people. His court was veiled in secrecy, his decrees final and unquestioned. Those who displeased him vanished, records struck clean, names erased. It was said he ordered temples closed to redirect offerings toward his own cult. The gods themselves, starved for the sake of his afterlife. No other pharaoh's pyramid was so large, so precise, so impossible. But the impossible came at a price. There were no days off, no reprieve. The scribes who dared record dissent wrote in riddles, in whispers carved into stone where no eyes would ever wander. Even generations later, his name was spoken with unease. The Greeks, visiting the ruins centuries on, told of cruelty, of a king who killed his own daughter to honor the gods, a legend, perhaps, but even legends grow from roots of truth. Khufu's sarcophagus, found deep within the pyramid, lay empty. His body never recovered. He built the greatest tomb in history, and was lost inside it. Was it irony, or justice? Perhaps the gods he tried to outshine took offense. Or perhaps, as the years passed, even the priests grew weary of his legacy and quietly removed him, denying him the eternity he sought. Yet still, his pyramid stands, uncracked by time, and touched by forgiveness. Visitors today walk its corridors in awe. They marvel at the geometry, the weight, the mystery, but few stop to wonder who was buried beneath the stones. Few listen to the silence in the walls, the silence of tens of thousands of voices pressed flat beneath stone, forgotten so that one name could live forever. Khufu. He sought immortality, but what he achieved was infamy, and as the stars pass above Giza, tracing ancient paths across the heavens, his pyramid looms not as a triumph, but as a warning. Not all monuments are built to honor. Some are built to bury the screams. The stars begin to fade now, swallowed slowly by the coming dawn, but in Egypt, dawn was never gentle. It arrived like judgment, spilling fire over the land, burning away dreams, mercy, and doubt. And in that fire walked kings who did not build but who took. One such man wore the double crown like a dagger. His name was Jennifer, the son of Khufu, the inheritor of the sun itself. His reign is often glossed over in history lost between giants. He came after Khufu and before Khafre, whose face still stares across eternity from the Sphinx. Jennifer left no towering pyramid on the Giza plateau. No colossal statues, just whispers, and scars. What we do know is this: Jennifer broke tradition. While his father and his father's father built their pyramids at Giza, Jennifer turned his back on that sacred ground. He chose instead the sun-bleached plateau of Abu Rawash, remote, rocky, rebellious. A statement. Why? Some say it was ideology, a shift in theology, that Jennifer saw himself not just as a god among men, but as the son of Ra, the sun god. He was the first pharaoh to formally take the title son of Ra, a divine lineage greater even than the mortal line of kings. Others believe it was exile by choice or necessity. Jennifer may have murdered his own brother. Kawab, Khufu's eldest son and rightful heir, died mysteriously before ever reaching the throne. Some accounts suggest Jennifer arranged his death to secure power, a quiet assassination, a blade in the dark, and once the crown was his, he erased Kawab's memory. The young prince's statues were defaced, inscriptions altered, even tomb offerings were removed, as if his very existence threatened Jennifer's divine right to rule. Imagine the tension at court corridors thick with whispers, eyes cast low, the scent of blood still clinging to the alabaster floors. The queen mother, devastated, the priests, conflicted, and Jennifer, sitting alone on the throne his brother should have taken, staring into the sun as though daring it to judge him. And judge him it did. Jennifer's pyramid at Abu Rawash was unlike any before it. Some believe it was once taller than Khufu's, a bid to eclipse the Great Pyramid itself. But today, it lies in ruin, torn apart. As if sabotaged, there are signs of deliberate destruction. Blocks pulled down, burial chambers desecrated. His image wiped clean from many of the places it once adorned. Later dynasties refused to preserve his memory. Even the list of kings skips him, or shortens his reign. He ruled for only 8 years. And then? Silence. No grand funerary cult, no shrine, no sacred text to praise his deeds, just wind. Some believe the priests turned against him. Others say his family, perhaps his own son, destroyed his works to reclaim honor, to restore the name of Khafre, the brother he tried to erase, or perhaps Jennifer simply built to high. Reach too far. The sun is not a god that tolerates rivals. And so, the man who called himself first chosen was buried beneath shattered stone and forgotten sand, his dream of divinity, and done. But the story does not end with his fall. It lingers in broken statues and mutilated hieroglyphs, in the silence where songs should be. Jennifer's life is not a legend, it is a warning written in absence, that the thirst for legacy, when driven by betrayal, can collapse faster than the walls meant to immortalize it. He wanted to be remembered as the first son of the sun, but even the sun casts shadows, and in his, Jennifer vanished. The desert grows quieter now, not still, never still, but heavy, the kind of silence that follows betrayal. The kind that hangs in the air like dust after a monument has fallen. And into that silence steps a figure carved in shadow and ambition, his name whispered with reverence and fear. Kshfari. To the casual eye, he was a builder, like his father Khufu, a pharaoh of vision. The man who erected the second Great Pyramid at Giza, whose face many believe became the eternal mask of the Sphinx itself. His legacy stands in stone, cold, imposing, silent. But stone does not tell the truth. Truth, in Egypt, is hidden in what is not written, in what was struck out, buried, left unsaid. And the truth of Khafre is darker than the granite that bears his name. He inherited a nation worn raw by his father's ambition and his brother's treachery. The people were exhausted, the land stretched thin. But instead of mercy, Khafre doubled down. He didn't rule to heal. He ruled to remind Egypt that kings are gods, and gods demand sacrifice. He brought the people back to Giza, not Menkaure to build again. The pyramid he commanded was nearly as tall as Khufu's, only a few meters shorter, but he built it on higher ground, ensuring that from a distance, it appeared equal or even greater. A subtle trick of the eye, or of pride, and beside it, the Sphinx, carved from bedrock, staring east into eternity. Its gaze is unblinking, its expression unreadable. Its lips tight as if guarding secrets too dangerous to speak. Khafre's secrets. We do not know how many died under his reign. Their names do not survive. Their bones, if found, are anonymous, scattered in the workers' camps buried beneath Giza's sand. But we know this: Khafre continued the brutal conscription of his father. He forced thousands into labor, dragged them from their homes, and bound them to his vision. And what was that vision? Immortality. Not through virtue, through scale. His court was a place of grandeur and suspicion. It is said Khafre was deeply paranoid, that he feared conspiracies, plotted shadows, voices behind veils. He empowered spies within his own priesthood, turned friend against friend. Whispers in the halls were enough to see men exiled, imprisoned, or worse. Those who served him walked with bent backs and silent mouths. Even his own family was not safe. There are fragments of records suggesting a power struggle in the later years of his reign. Sons positioning themselves for the throne. One prince, possibly Menkaure, vanished from texts for a time, only to reappear with the crown after Khafre's death. Was it coincidence, or the quiet result of a dynastic purge? And then there is the Sphinx. Some believe it was his creation, others argue it predates even Khafre. But one thing is certain: its features resemble his. Not just in the structure of the face, but in the absence of compassion. The Sphinx does not welcome. It watches. Judges. Silently dares time itself to forget the name of the man who ordered it into being. Yet time forgets everything, even kings. Khafre was buried likely in his pyramid, though his body has never been found. His sarcophagus lies empty. His tomb was sealed. But something about it feels rushed, unfinished. As if the builders, once forced to create glory, chose to abandon it the moment the pharaoh's breath left him. Was it fear that lingered after his death, or relief? He ruled for decades, but left no poetry, no love songs, no personal hymns. Only scale, only stone. The monuments remain, yes, but the man inside them is hollow. His legacy is not found in hearts, only in heights, and perhaps that is the truest measure of his reign. Khafre built himself into the landscape. His pyramid still cuts the sky. The Sphinx still holds its eternal vigil. But they are not testaments of love, they are warnings. That power without grace becomes tyranny, that silence can be louder than praise, and that even gods carved from rock will one day fall beneath the weight of their own gaze. The sands shift once more, as they always do, swallowing one story, revealing another. And from beneath the weight of centuries, another name surfaces. Not as loud as Khufu, nor as feared as Khafre, but no less haunting. Me and Kauri. To many, he is remembered as the gentle one, the kind king. The ruler who broke the chain of cruelty that ran like blood through his dynasty. But the desert remembers differently. His pyramid stands beside those of his father and grandfather, smaller, humbler, almost modest by comparison. Some call it a sign of compassion. Others say he lacked the power or time to build something greater. Yet even this so-called mercy is tangled in contradiction. Menkaure ruled in the long shadow of his bloodline. The son of Khafre, the grandson of Khufu, he inherited a world sculpted by tyranny and raised on fear. The people were tired, the priests were weary. The gods had grown distant, or perhaps deaf, and Menkaure was not deaf. He listened, but listening is not the same as kindness. According to legend told in passing by Herodotus centuries later, Menkaure wept when the oracle of Budo told him he would die young. Not out of fear for himself, but sorrow for the people. He vowed to outwit fate, turning his days into nights, and nights into days, by lighting torches and pretending to extend his life. But was this compassion, or desperation? Did he fear death, or the judgment that would follow? For his pyramid, though smaller, is not empty of cruelty. Excavations around his mortuary complex reveal workers' tombs hastily constructed, bodies buried without ceremony, evidence of labor, evidence of suffering. The system of forced work did not end with Khafre. It simply became quieter, more veiled, and Menkaure's burial temple, curiously, was never completed. In the stone blocks scattered nearby, ancient tool marks remain, as though the workers dropped their tools mid-chisel and never returned. Some believe he died suddenly, leaving the project unfinished. Others whisper something darker, that the project was abandoned not because of death, but because of resentment. One unfinished statue shows the king flanked by two goddesses, Hathor and the personification of a nome, a province. They embrace him, suggesting harmony, unity. But his expression is distant, almost vacant, not warmth. Butte resignation. There's something tragic in his image. As if even in stone, he knew he would never escape the shadow of those who came before. He was born into legacy, but not greatness. He ruled an empire still bleeding from his ancestors' ambitions, and though he may have softened the grip of the throne, he could not loosen it entirely. Even his tomb tells a strange story. In the 1830s, when explorers opened it, they found a sarcophagus beautifully carved, made of basalt, heavy, smooth, regal. It was placed aboard a ship to be transported to England, but the ship sank in a storm off the coast of Spain. The sarcophagus was lost to the sea, like so much of Menkaure's life vanished in transit, swallowed before it could be displayed. As if the earth itself refused to let his memory be dissected. Today, his remains, or what's believed to be his remains, rest in the Cairo Museum. A shriveled, broken form once mistaken for a later burial. A king forgotten even in death, until time reluctantly gave him back his name. But what do we truly remember? A ruler who tried to be better, or a man too small to break the cycle? Menkaure's pyramid is elegant, yes, his statues refined. But behind every polished surface is a truth Egypt rarely spoke aloud. That even mercy, in the hands of a pharaoh, still came wrapped in command. That even soft power is still power. And as the winds howl across the Giza plateau, they pass over three pyramids, grandfather, father, son, monuments rising in scale, and then suddenly shrinking. A crescendo of cruelty, then a whisper. But a whisper is not an apology. It is only the sound left when the shouting ends. The desert is patient. It waits, it watches. It does not forget. Centuries passed like drifting smoke after Menkaure. Dynasties rose and crumbled, temples bloomed and withered like lotus flowers in flood and drought. The gods shifted, priests whispered new names, and the Nile carried memory downstream. But cruelty always found its way back. And so, we come to a ruler whose name does not echo from pyramids, but from violence. Usrkf. He was the first pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, and at first glance, he seems a reformer. A man who shifted Egypt's focus from stone monuments to the divine order of Ra, the sun god. He established the famed sun temples, open-air sanctuaries flooded with light, unlike the tombs of darkness built by his predecessors, but light can blind. And sometimes, it burns. Userkaf was not born into power. He married into it. His wife, a princess of royal blood, provided legitimacy. But his ambition provided everything else. The court had grown bloated with rival families and leftover loyalties from the 4th dynasty, and Userkaf trimmed the fat. He began his reign with blood. Though the records are sparse, carefully worded, cautiously preserved, we know that several noble lines vanish around the time he takes the throne. Estates were seized, tombs desecrated, titles revoked. Those who once walked freely in the halls of power disappeared from the record entirely. The priests of Ra, elevated under his rule, suddenly held unprecedented influence. And in exchange, they turned their gaze from the purges, because Userkaf understood something new, that to control Egypt, you no longer had to rule with just the sword or the whip. You could rule with doctrine. You could hide tyranny in ritual. He restructured the priesthood, poured resources into solar temples. The cult of Ra flourished, and with it, a new kind of king, one who did not build for himself in the afterlife, but built temples to anchor the gods to his name. But even gods demand labor, and while pyramids shrank, the burden on the people did not. Under the banner of holiness, new conscriptions
Farmers
were uprooted, craftsmen repurposed. The temples needed stone, gold, incense. The sun would not rise on its own, it needed sacrifice. His sun temple at Abu Ghurab was lined with alabaster and red granite, crowned with a towering obelisk said to reflect the light of Ra himself. It was a beacon, a symbol of power radiating from the heavens, but those who carried the stone saw no light. Userkaf's rule was short, barely a decade. But in that time, he rewired Egypt's soul. He shifted cruelty from spectacle to institution. No longer the brutal lashings of a paranoid tyrant or the suffocating labor of a pyramid god king. No, his was colder, more calculating. He turned worship into obedience, and obedience into control. When he died, he was buried in a modest pyramid near Djoser's step monument, as if humbling himself before the great kings of old. But it was a mask. His legacy would not be measured by height, but by the machinery he left behind, a state where power no longer needed to roar. It could whisper through the mouths of priests. His son would inherit the throne. But it was his structure that endured. The fifth dynasty would continue to cloak its cruelty in sanctity, offering the people not justice, but spectacle, not mercy, but order. Userkaf's tomb lies quiet now, its pyramid worn and eroded. Most visitors pass it by. It is not grand. It does not boast, but beneath its broken stones, something still lingers. The beginning of a new Egypt, one where control did not always bleed, but bled when it needed to. One where cruelty smiled from behind the robes of holiness, and where the sun, once a source of life, came a throne no man could touch without burning. The sun hangs high over the desert, nor relentless, absolute. It scours the earth with golden fire, burning away shadow, compassion, even memory. And beneath that pitiless gaze, the next pharaoh took his place not as a servant of Ra, but as his very embodiment. Sahir, the second king of the fifth dynasty, son of Userkaf, inherited not just a throne but a blueprint, a kingdom now welded to the cult of the sun. The divine order had changed, and Sahir knew how to wield it. His reign, by many accounts, was a golden one. Trade flourished. Expeditions reached across the seas to Punt and beyond. Ships returned heavy with myrrh, incense, panther skins, and exotic trees. Egypt's coffers swelled. Art grew more refined, temples more graceful. To the untrained eye, Sahir's rule was an age of enlightenment, but gold often hides the rust beneath. Sahir's court was not gentle. It was disciplined, controlled. His temples praised him as a god-king, the son of Ra, the bringer of light. His name was carved beside images of bound foreigners, beaten enemies, and kneeling tribute-bearers, all offering their riches and bodies to the radiant pharaoh. He, too, built. But not pyramids like Khufu. Sahir's masterpiece was his mortuary temple at Abusir, a complex unlike any before it. Intricate reliefs lined its walls, scenes of battle, worship, exotic animals led in chains, servants bent beneath cargo. And at the center of it all, always, Sahir, calm, detached, divine. To look upon those carvings is to enter his mind. To see how he wanted to be remembered, unchallenged, unbothered, untouchable. But every block of that temple was carved by calloused hands, and every victory he displayed, whether military or diplomatic, came at a human cost. Soldiers conscripted, Nubian and Libyan captives marched across the desert in shackles. Women and children reclassified as property. Gifts for the living god. This was the new cruelty of the fifth dynasty, not raw and visible like the whip of Khufu, but refined, elegant, weaponized through ideology and imagery. You were not crushed beneath the weight of stone anymore. You were erased from the record, buried alive beneath the symbols of prosperity. Even nature bowed to him. Relief shows Sahir inspecting gardens, orchards, sacred lakes filled with fish, all captured, cultivated, arranged for his pleasure. The land itself was reshaped to obey, but nature does not forget its wildness. And Sahir, for all his order and art, ruled with quiet paranoia. He stationed guards not just at his temples, but in the halls of his officials. Trusted only the priests he appointed himself. His administration grew thick with scribes, spies, and record keepers. And those who did not match his vision vanished. It is said that under his rule, the archives of the priesthood swelled. Every name, every offering, every breath accounted for. Order elevated to obsession. The divine machine could not afford a single broken cog. Even death was organized. His pyramid at Abusir was precise, symmetrical, mathematically perfect. Not large, but strategic. The chambers inside arranged not for grandeur, but for eternal efficiency. His body, preserved for all time. His name, repeated endlessly in inscriptions, Sahir, the beloved of Ra. But what is love when it is enforced? And what becomes of a people ruled not with fear alone, but with beauty twisted into submission? Sahir died peacefully, we are told. But peace, like stone, can be a prison. His son succeeded him. His temple still stands, its carvings faded but intact. Tourists walk its ancient floors now, marveling at the art. Few ask about the hands that carved it. Fewer still wonder where the captives went. The temple does not answer. It only watches. As Sahir once did, serene and merciless, eternal in his silence, because cruelty, when disguised as order, becomes invisible, and those who suffer under it disappear without a sound. The wind returns, not soft now, but sharp. It tears across the sands like a memory uninvited. Where once it danced through temple courtyards, now it moans between shattered columns and broken lintels. The golden hush that followed Sahir's rule begins to fracture, the light dims. And from the cracks in Egypt's carefully built order, another ruler steps forward, one who would tighten the grip of control, and slowly squeeze the air from the lungs of his kingdom. Neferkherkhakai, to the people, he was a son of gods, the divine link in the sacred chain of succession. But beneath the polished titles and sacred rites, he was something more unsettling, a man obsessed with order, with rules, with precision. Not out of love, but fear. His name meant beautiful is the soul of Ra. But what does beauty mean when it lives in shadows? Neferkher was the son of Sahir, inheritor of a system now wrapped around the sun cult of Ra. Temples had grown powerful. Priests, once servants, had become gatekeepers of divine favor. And Egypt itself had begun to change, no longer a place ruled simply by bloodline or sword, but by administration, by ritual, by decree. Neferkher saw what his father had begun and resolved to perfect it. He would not merely be a king. He would be the architect of authority itself. It started subtly. In the first years of his reign, he issued the earliest known royal decree that survives to this day, carved into limestone and buried for millennia beneath the sands of Abusir. At a glance, it seemed kind, granting exemptions to a local priesthood, affirming rights and privileges. But beneath the delicate script was something more important, a signature. A symbol of central control, a reminder that all power, even divine, flowed through him. It was the beginning of a paper empire. Records exploded under Neferkher. Scribes became powerful. Bureaucrats swelled in number. Taxes were measured with no accuracy. Inventories of grain, livestock, all, incense counted and recounted, not for prosperity, but for control. The temples were watched. The people were counted. The gods were weighed. Truth, in Neferkher's Egypt, was no longer a sacred balance. It was a tool. Something etched in ledgers, tracked on papyrus, recited before stone-faced overseers who served not faith, but obedience. He built, yes, as all kings did, but his monument at Abusir tells a different story. It began grandly enough. His pyramid was meant to rise tall, its causeway sweeping down to the Nile in a flourish of devotion. It would be the tallest structure at Abusir, a testament to divine logic. But somewhere in its construction, something broke. The outer casing stones were never completed. The mortuary temple was cobbled together hastily, with mud brick and fragments from other projects. The burial chambers, rough and undecorated, lacked the reverent care given to even lesser nobles. Why? Was it sudden death? Sabotage? Or had the very system he spent his life building turned against him? His sons were young. Factions stirred within the royal court. Priests, now emboldened by years of favor, began staking their own claims. The delicate machinery of his rule, so meticulous, so brittle, began to creak. And in that creaking, silence. After Neferkher's death, there was no great mourning. No golden festival of unification, only confusion. His pyramid was completed by his successors, quickly, with whatever materials were left. The grand causeway, never finished. The surrounding complex, sparse, skeletal. Even his body, if it was buried there at all, left no trace. There is something tragic in his fall, not because he was a good man, but because he was a man who thought that structure could replace humanity. That if he just organized the world tightly enough, it wouldn't fall apart. But people do not live inside spreadsheets, and gods do not kneel to files and forms. Neferker's Egypt was the beginning of something hollow, a kingdom where cruelty wore the mask of ritual, where control was no longer screamed, but whispered through protocol, embedded in stone. He saw his rule as divine alignment, a cosmic formula. But the stars do not wait for kings, and the sun burns those who reach too high. Today, visitors walk among the ruins of his pyramid and see only dust and weathered stone. It stands, barely, beside the monuments of his father and his son, but it leans, it crumbles, it remembers. Archaeologists found caches of papyri near the temple, dusty ledgers of workers' names, ration lists, disciplinary notes. Not poetry, not prophecy, just the sounds of life reduced to ink and measurement. No hymns, no love letters, no whispers of who he truly was, only balance sheets. Even the priests who once sang his praises turned on each other. In the decades that followed, their loyalty shifted like sand, their temples growing into political machines, more concerned with wealth than worship. He had empowered them, and in doing so, sowed the seeds of his own oblivion. Neferker's reign was not the reign of blood and chains like Khufu, but it was colder, quieter, more suffocating. A bureaucracy of cruelty, a silence that kept growing. Because when cruelty is disguised as order, when fear is filed in drawers and hidden in scrolls, it becomes harder to see, harder to name, but no less deadly. And so he sits now, not in glory, but in fragments. A name carved twice into history, but felt not once in the heart of his people. The pyramid still holds its shape, if only just. The desert holds its breath. And in the long silence between stone and sky, one truth remains. He tried to rule by numbers, but no one ever counts the cost of being forgotten. The night air thickens again, as if the desert itself is holding something back. The stars flicker behind a curtain of dust, and in the distant dark, the old gods turn their faces away. Egypt, once firm beneath the feet of kings, begins to tremble, not from rebellion, not yet, but from rot. A new pharaoh takes the throne, Shesepper, better known to us as Shepseskare, and almost nothing else. His name is a ghost, a whisper half swallowed by time. There are no grand statues, no lengthy inscriptions, no epic battles carved into limestone reliefs. He left behind no pyramid we can point to with certainty. No finished temple, not even a clear memory. But his absence is louder than many kings' legacies, because Shepseskare ruled in the space between collapse and illusion. A brief, flickering reign, some say just a few months, others barely a season. His name is scrawled hastily into one king list, and even then, some scribe scratched it out later. A mistake, an embarrassment, or something more dangerous, a ruler whose memory was not simply forgotten, but erased. This is a reign defined not by what is there, but by what is missing. He was likely a usurper, or at least, not the chosen heir. He may have been a grandson of Neferker, or perhaps just a noble with ambition. But in the sudden chaos following the deaths of two kings in quick succession, the court cracked. The priesthood, now bloated with influence, could be bought. And Shepseskare may have bought them all briefly. There is a scar of a pyramid platform near Abusir, a flat foundation, dug hastily into the bedrock and abandoned just as quickly. It was meant to be something, a new monument, a statement of power, but nothing ever rose. No casing stones, no chambers, just an empty socket in the desert, like a grave with no body. And that is his legacy. What could make an entire kingdom turn its face away from a pharaoh? What could make a man powerful enough to wear the crown disappear? Some believe he was killed, quietly, perhaps by his successor. Others think his support dissolved, the priesthood backing away like jackals once the meat spoiled. He had no time to prove his divinity, no time to rewrite law, no time to build, to bless, to breathe. And Egypt, the eternal land, has no use for weak kings. In the age of pyramids, even a short reign required planning, labor, the backing of gods and governors. But Shepseskare had only dust. He stood atop the crumbling scaffolding of the Fifth Dynasty's illusions, of divine kingship, of centralized order, of an unbreakable system. But the cracks were now undeniable. The temple system, once the source of spiritual nourishment, had become political. The sun cult of Ra, once a symbol of unity, was now a battlefield of influence. Priests enriched themselves, scribes altered records. Every king needed divine legitimacy. And in Shepsescare's case, perhaps he didn't have it. Or worse, perhaps he stole it. Because a name carved in stone is power, but a name struck from the record is damnation. He left behind no known tomb, no body, just traces, a seal here, a broken inscription there, the outline of a plan that never took shape. Even ancient Egyptian historians debated whether he was real. Even the gods seemed unwilling to speak on his behalf. But the earth remembers. In that shallow foundation, in Abusir, in the shattered balance of a dynasty once considered eternal, his presence lingers. The winds that sweep across it do not whisper his name. They simply pass, empty, indifferent. He is the pharaoh who vanished, the shadow between kings. And perhaps that is more terrifying than all the cruel pharaohs who came before. Because at least Khufu was feared. At least Khafre was remembered. But Shepsescare, he was nothing. And in Egypt, the land where even the lowest hoped for immortality in name, nothingness was the worst fate of all. A forgotten god, a lost king, a silence more permanent than stone. As the desert sighs and swallows his memory once more, we move forward, deeper into the decay. The sun cult will falter, the bureaucracy will fracture. And the kings will no longer rule as gods, but as men clawing at the crumbling edges of illusion. But for now, we leave behind the phantom king, and we step toward the next shadow, where memory still lingers, but just barely. The desert does not mourn. It buries. It covers the bones of kings and the failures of dynasties alike, smoothing over betrayal and ambition with the same steady hand. And as the fifth dynasty staggers forward, weakened by power struggles and hollowed by its own sacred machinery, one man climbs from the sand, not to restore glory, but to hold together what little remains. His name was Neferufer, the son of Neferkare, the prince born of shifting sands and fractured faith, but the crown sat uneasy on his brow. Neferufer ruled for only a whisper of time, perhaps 2 years, maybe less. And in that short breath of a reign, he became not a god, not a conqueror, but something far more human. A man overwhelmed, a pharaoh who built not eternity, but a tomb for unfulfilled dreams. His pyramid still stands, though barely. At Abusir, among the fading giants of his ancestors, lies a broken monument. It was meant to be another step in the sun cult's divine procession, a sanctuary of light and order, but instead, it remains forever incomplete. A ruin from the moment it was born. The ancient name of his pyramid, divine are the boss spirits of Neferufer, now feels cruel in hindsight. There was no divine triumph. No smooth casing stones, no perfect geometry. The structure rises only partway before ending abruptly, like a prayer interrupted by death. Some call it the unfinished pyramid. Others call it what it truly is, a wound. Archaeologists who excavated the site found chaos. Masonry left scattered, tools abandoned, mortuary chambers incomplete. The body of Neferufer was hastily mummified, his limbs bound together, his chest caved, his face pressed into eternity with a look of surprise. He wasn't ready. No one was. His funeral, once planned as a months-long ritual of divine transformation, was compressed into days. His mortuary temple was thrown together in a panic, mud brick and limestone stacked without ceremony. Reliefs that would have glorified his name were never carved. The priests offered hurried prayers, and the court moved on, because Egypt could not wait for a broken king. The fifth dynasty was faltering, the bureaucracy bloated. The priesthood, once a tool of kings, had grown independent, feeding on tithes and favors, powerful enough now to challenge the throne instead of serving it. And Neferufer, young and likely unprepared, was swallowed by it all. He had no time to wage war, no time to build temples, no time to shape Egypt in his image. What little we know of him comes from fragments, bits of statues, pieces of stone, a few rushed inscriptions. There is one image, a broken statue, his face serene, his eyes gazing slightly upward, as if still trying to understand why the gods turned away. Was he kind? Was he cruel? We will never know. Perhaps he wanted to reform the system. Perhaps he feared the growing power of the priesthood. Or perhaps he was simply caught between the crumbling stones of a once great machine, a machine that now devoured even those who sat at its highest seat. But his story does not end with him, because after his death, something remarkable happened. His younger brother, Nayuser, took the throne. And in a rare act of dynastic compassion, he honored Neferufer's memory. He completed part of the mortuary temple. He preserved his brother's name in the records. He did what few kings ever did. He ensured a failed reign would not vanish. And so, Neferufer lingers, not as a mighty pharaoh, but as a whisper carried by others. His pyramid may be broken, his reign forgotten by most, but his name was saved, and in Egypt, that meant everything, because to be forgotten was to die a second death. And Neferufer, the young, the unfinished, the almost king, was spared that final silence. Even in ruin, there is remembrance. Even in failure, a flicker of humanity. As the sun sets over his broken tomb, shadows fall long across the stones, and in that soft hush, we see a different kind of legacy. Not one carved by dominance or fear, but by fragility. And fragility, in a world of gods, is the most human truth of all. The sun rises again over Abusir, not with triumph, but with quiet resolve. Its light stretches across half-finished pyramids, scattered stone blocks, and wine-carved temple walls. This is no longer the Egypt of boundless ambition. The edge of towering monuments has passed. What remains is endurance, and one king who understood that survival, not grandeur, would define the times. Nayuser, the younger brother, the second son, the one who was not meant to wear the crown, but did. And unlike those who ruled before him, Nayuser was not trying to outshine the past. He was trying to keep it from collapsing. He took power in the wake of chaos. Neferufer, his brother, was dead. Shepsiskare, the usurper, had vanished. The court was fractured, the priests were growing too bold, and the people, weary from decades of labor and divine silence, had begun to turn their eyes not to kings, but to gods themselves. Nayuser saw all of this, and he didn't try to fight the tide. He flowed with it. He focused not on monuments for himself, but on the sacred architecture of Egypt's soul. He poured his energy into the sun temple of Ra, Abu Ghurab, the most magnificent ever built. Towering obelisks, sacred courtyards, intricate reliefs of offerings and festivals, it was a holy stage meant not for a king, but for the god behind the king. This was Nayuser's quiet genius. He made himself indispensable not by declaring himself divine, but by becoming Ra's most faithful servant. He let the god shine brighter, and in doing so, he survived. But that does not mean he was weak. Nayuser ruled longer than any king of his dynasty, 3 full decades. In that time, he restored stability. He finished his brother's broken pyramid temple, a rare gesture of royal humility. He kept the priesthood in check, not through fear, but through mutual need. He managed the sprawling bureaucracy with calm efficiency. And perhaps most telling of all, no known revolts or internal crises marked his reign. There were no towering pyramids raised in his name, no new wars of conquest, no grand political shifts, just order, structure, silence. And in ancient Egypt, silence could be a kind of peace. His own pyramid, nestled among his father's and brother's at Abusir, was modest, functional, but the temple complex attached to it was detailed and alive. Scenes of daily life, cattle being counted, scribes recording grain, priests performing rituals, cover its walls. Not just propaganda, but documentary, a portrait of a kingdom working. And yet, even in this calm, shadows gathered, for Nayuser's reign, while stable, could not reverse the slow decay of royal power. The priesthood continued to expand. Local governors, nomarchs, grew stronger. And the people, once bound to the pharaoh's divine will, were now more loyal to temples than to the throne. Nayuser had held the center, but only barely. His legacy is not written in golden triumph, but in quiet endurance. He did not conquer, he preserved. He did not command worship, he facilitated it. He did not try to rival the great pyramids, he built around their fading shadows. And in that humility, perhaps, was wisdom. Because Nayuser seemed to understand what so many kings did not. That power is not always taken by force. Sometimes, it just slips quietly away. And when he died, he left behind a dynasty that was still standing, not strong, but upright. A delicate structure propped against time. It would not last much longer. The seams were beginning to fray. The rituals, once living, were beginning to fossilize. The throne, once untouchable, would soon be bartered and broken, but for a brief moment, there was still balance, because one king, born in the shadow of collapse, chose not to reach higher than his gods, but to serve them, and in doing so, he bought Egypt a little more time. Now the wind sighs through his temple ruins, where once sacred festivals blazed in the sun. The obelisk still points skyward, chipped but defiant. The walls, though worn, still speak. They do not shout, they do not boast. They whisper the story of a man who ruled not with cruelty, but with care, and in a history carved with blood and fire. That whisper is a miracle. The sands are shifting again, not in fury, but in fatigue. Egypt is tired. The thrones have been occupied, the rituals repeated, the pyramids built and broken. The priests chant, the scribes tally, the farmers bow. But behind it all, something vital is slipping away. The divine glow that once made kings untouchable is now a flicker, just another flame among many. And into this waning light steps Menkaure. His name is nearly forgotten, his legacy barely whispers, and yet, his reign marks a turning point, not because of what he built, but because of what he couldn't. He followed in the wake of Niuser, that quiet, capable king who had held the 5th dynasty together with sheer steadiness. But Menkaure did not inherit that same steadiness. He inherited a kingdom stretched thin and fading fast. The evidence of his rule is like a puzzle missing to many pieces. His name appears in a few king lists, a few Sun Temple fragments, one decrepit, half-vanished monument, but the image that emerges from the gaps is haunting, a pharaoh with almost no power, clinging to tradition while the very idea of kingship rotted beneath him. They say he built a pyramid, somewhere. Some scholars believe it's the ruined structure known as the Headless Pyramid at Saqqara, so called because it's collapsed so completely that even its peak and original entrance are gone. Buried beneath layers of neglect, it no longer points to the heavens. It merely sinks into the ground, anonymous, a perfect metaphor for Menkaure. There is no surviving mortuary temple, no great solar monument. His sun cult, once the fiery heart of the 5th dynasty, had gone dark. This is how far the divine kings had fallen. From Khufu's skyscraping vision to this, a nameless ruin melting into dust. But perhaps the most telling detail of all, Menkaure was the last pharaoh to even attempt a sun temple. After him, no more would be built. The cult of Ra, once the central pillar of royal power, was now too bloated, too independent, too powerful. Pharaohs no longer stood above the priests, they stood beneath them. And Menkaure, he was the final breath of that old illusion. He ruled for about 8 years, maybe 9. But in that time, nothing he created lasted, not in stone, not in spirit. He issued no grand decrees, no campaigns of conquest. He left behind no sons who would shake the heavens. His reign is like a fading heartbeat, not dead, but barely felt. And what does it mean when a king becomes a shadow during his own lifetime? When his pyramid cannot be found? When his name must be reconstructed from scattered fragments and broken seals? What does it mean when the gods no longer speak through the king, but through those who outlive him? Somewhere, in the eroded ruins of Saqqara, his bones may still rest, but they rest in silence. No hymns, no processions, just the dry wind and the sifting dust. It is said that every pharaoh builds his afterlife with his deeds, that eternity is not given, but earned. And if that's true, then perhaps Menkaure walks alone in the field of reeds, not in torment, but in obscurity. The forgotten pharaoh of a forgotten moment, caught between the dying breath of the 5th dynasty and the chaos yet to come. He tried to be like those before him. He tried to keep the rituals alive. He tried to build, but sometimes, trying is not enough. And now, his story is little more than a question. Was he a ruler, or just the echo of one? The gods offer no answer, and the sands remain silent. The silence grows heavier now, not the sacred hush of temples or the soft lull of the Nile, but the suffocating quiet that follows collapse. Egypt is not screaming, it is not bleeding, it is simply forgetting. And the next king, Djedkarasisi, arrives not to restore the old glory, but to preside over its disintegration, not with violence, not with mercy, but with distance. He ruled for over 40 years, a reign long enough to change everything. And what he changed was the soul of kingship itself. Gone was the worship of the sun god Ra as the singular pillar of divine order. Gone were the grand solar temples, once symbols of unity and celestial power. Gone was the idea that the king stood above the priesthood, untouchable and eternal. Djedkare did not challenge these shifts. He accepted them. He adapted. And in doing so, he became something new, a different kind of pharaoh. No longer the living god. Now, the administrator. He ruled from the shadows of temples rather than the peaks of pyramids. He strengthened the bureaucracy, turning Egypt into a machine that could run without miracles. He expanded trade, reinforced borders, delegated power to loyal officials, and quietly, perhaps fatally, he allowed the priesthood to grow stronger than the throne itself. He is remembered, oddly enough, as a competent and wise king. His name appears in inscriptions across Egypt. His reign saw peace, diplomacy, economic stability. But beneath that calm surface, a rupture had begun, because Djedkarasisi was the first king to abandon Busir, the sacred burial ground of his predecessors. He turned his back on the solar temples. He walked away from the rituals that had once made kings divine. Instead, he built his tomb at Saqqara, in a corner of the desert worn thin by wind and time. His pyramid, now reduced to a jagged hill of rubble, was once known as beautiful as Djedkar. But time has not been kind. No grand causeways, no surviving mortuary complex, just silence. And maybe that was fitting, because Djedkar's legacy was never in stone. It was in systems. He reshaped Egypt from a kingdom of gods into a kingdom of men. And what do men crave? Control. He appointed more officials than any pharaoh before him. He stretched Egypt's fingers far south into Nubia and west toward the Libyan deserts. He forged alliances, exchanged gifts with faraway lands. He ruled not by divine presence, but by paperwork. But here's the shadow hiding behind all his order. By making the system stronger than the man, he made the man replaceable. And once the pharaoh was no longer sacred, just a node in the network, the soul of Egypt began to drift. Djedkarasisi may have kept the kingdom running, but he could not make it believe. The people still worked, still prayed, still feared, but something had gone cold. Even the gods seemed quieter now. There were fewer festivals, fewer temple renovations, fewer inscriptions carved in stone to promise eternal life. And yet, Djedkar ruled, and ruled, and ruled, until one day, he didn't. His death, like his rule, is obscure. His pyramid slowly collapsed. His name faded from popular memory, not through hatred, but through distance. He had lived too long, and in living, had let too much go. Today, his ruined tomb lies mostly unvisited. Tourists walk past it, not knowing its name. The desert does not speak of him. The gods do not cry out for him. But the scribes still whisper his influence, because he built the skeleton of a new Egypt. A place where kings no longer ruled by fear or wonder, but by routine. He turned the pharaoh into a man, and in doing so, doomed the dynasty, not with a crash, but with a slow, unraveling breath. And so we leave Djedkar's shadow behind, not in awe, but in stillness, because sometimes the cruelest legacy is not the blood spilled or the stones raised, but the silence that follows when no one remembers how to believe. The sand no longer shifts, it settles. Egypt, once alive with divine command, ringing with the voices of gods and kings, has grown still, not peaceful, not dead, just tired. The monuments remain, but their meanings blur. The rituals continue, but their power has faded. And as we step deeper into the dusk of the 5th dynasty, we meet a king wrapped not in glory, but in questions. Unas, the last pharaoh of his line, a man who ruled in the long shadow of something already lost. He came to power as the seams of divinity unraveled. The priesthood no longer bowed, they bargained. The people no longer wept with awe, they watched with indifference. The pyramid, once a stairway to the stars, had become an obligation. And yet, Unas built. His pyramid still stands at the edge of Saqqara, small and plain from the outside. Nothing like the thunderous ambition of Khufu or the confident geometry of Sneferu. Just a squat rise of worn limestone, its casing long stripped by centuries of theft and wind. But step inside, and everything changes. Within those narrow, dark corridors lies something unprecedented, something quietly revolutionary. Not in politics, not in conquest, in words, because Unas did what no pharaoh before him had dared to do. He carved prayers into the walls of his tomb. The pyramid texts, over 700 spells, invocations, and hymns etched into the stone, not to dazzle the living, but to guide the dead. Not for subjects to see, but for gods to hear. It was an act of fear, and of faith. Fear, because Unas knew the old ways were no longer enough. The divine link between king and afterlife had weakened. He could not rely on memory or on legacy. So he wrote his immortality down, line after line, spell after spell, just in case the gods forgot who he was. But it was also faith. Faith that words had power. That poetry could open gates no pyramid could. That a king could speak across eternity, not with gold, but with breath turned to stone. And what do these texts say? They are strange, haunting, beautiful. They speak of the king becoming a star, of sailing across the sky with Ra, of devouring the gods to absorb their strength, of rising from the sarcophagus not as a corpse, but as a force of nature. In one spell, Unas eats the gods themselves. Unas is the bull of heaven. He has consumed the intelligence of every god. Unas has swallowed their spirits, their hearts, their knowledge. Unas is mighty among the gods. It is defiance. It is desperation. It is poetry carved in fear of being nothing, because Unas knew what all who came before had begun to feel. The veil between king and man was gone. He ruled a weary Egypt. The temples were full, not with worshippers, but with administrators. The economy ground forward, powered by habit, not hope. Local governors ruled their nomes like petty kings, slowly breaking Egypt apart under the skin. And Unas, he did not fight it. He retreated inward. His pyramid is not the tallest. His rule is not the longest. But his tomb is the most intimate. He gave us his voice. He gave us his doubt. He gave us his final plea. Remember me, not through monuments, not through war, but through language. He knew that stone could be broken, gold could be stolen, names could be erased, but words could haunt. And they have. Thousands of years later, scholars would kneel inside his tomb and whisper the same spells he once chanted to the stars. His voice, carved in darkness, would travel through history, not booming, not royal, but trembling, human. Unas was the last king of the 5th dynasty, not because he failed, but because the world that created the dynasty had already slipped away. His reign marks the end of belief in divine rule as absolute, the end of the pharaoh as god, the end of certainty, and the beginning of something far stranger, a world where kings are no longer eternal, but afraid. And in that fear, Unas gave us something more lasting than any monument. He let us hear him whisper. In the dark, the whisper fades, but the silence remains. Heavy, loaded, cracked, because after Unas, there is no plan, no clean succession, no carefully prepared crown waiting for a worthy brow. Only questions. Egypt, for the first time in centuries, does not know who rules it. The 5th dynasty is over, but the 6th doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with doubt, and into that space steps Teddy, a man not born to the divine line, but married into it. He was no son of kings, no heir to the great builders. He rose not from holy blood, but from politics. He married a daughter of Unas, a princess whose womb made him royal, but power born through marriage is fragile. It must be protected, or taken back. Teddy ruled for 12 years, long enough to leave a scar, but not long enough to explain it, because from the very start, the kingdom around him was fraying. The priesthood of Tyre in Memphis had grown arrogant. The high priests of Ra still clung to their sun cult, and the rising class of nomarchs, governors in Egypt's outer provinces, began carving out power of their own. Teddy found himself surrounded by men who didn't serve the pharaoh. They tolerated him, so he tried to play all sides. He elevated officials who were loyal to the temples. He granted favors to governors in the provinces. He allowed priests to expand their estates. He scattered appointments like seeds into dangerous soil. And for a moment, it worked. But there are whispers in the tombs, hints in broken texts, a wound that never quite healed, because Teddy was assassinated. Not in battle, not by rebellion, but quietly, from within. The ancient historian Moneto, writing thousands of years later, says Teddy was murdered by his guards. A cold, sudden betrayal from those meant to shield him. Imagine it, the pharaoh, God on earth, smothered in the dark by his own protectors. Not honored, not mourned, just erased. Why? Because he made too many promises. Because he gave too much away. Because Egypt was no longer a kingdom of one voice, but a battleground of 1,000 whispers. And in that chaos, the idea of the pharaoh, divine, supreme, untouchable, died more completely than any corpse in a pyramid. His tomb still stands at Saqqara, small, unremarkable, crumbling. Inside, more pyramid texts, like those Unas had carved before him, fill the walls in solemn chant. He, too, tried to bargain with the gods, tried to write his way into eternity, but his words don't echo. They sit heavy, still, mute, because Teddy's voice was never his own. He spoke through others. He ruled through compromise, and in the end, he died not as a god, but as a man who misjudged the room. The 6th dynasty was born not in triumph, but in betrayal. It was the beginning of the end. A slow unraveling that would take a century to complete, not with fire, but with forgetfulness. Egypt would go on, yes. It would build more pyramids, name more kings, host more festivals, but the soul had cracked. And Teddy, the first king of a new age, was also its first casualty. He did not fall in battle. He did not lose a war. He simply vanished into the machinery of a kingdom that no longer needed gods, only power. And power, as he learned it, is never loyal. The sands no longer shift with purpose. They simply cover the tombs, cover the names, cover the voices of kings who once believed they could command the heavens. And yet, Egypt marches on, not with pride, but inertia, a kingdom still grand in form, but hollow at the core. The sixth dynasty grows long, too long, and at its center is a man who ruled longer than any other pharaoh in history. A king whose reign stretched across decades like a drought, so long that even time itself seemed to grow tired. His name was Pepi II. He became king as a child, a boy no older than 6. The throne, too large for his tiny body, became something he would grow into slowly, quietly, until it was all he knew. But what kind of king does a boy become when the gods are already silent? When the rituals are mechanical, when loyalty is bought, and never given freely? He ruled for over 90 years, longer than anyone should. And in the beginning, he tried. We have letters, still preserved in the dust, addressed to generals and governors. In one, he writes to a man named Harkuf, a high official returning from Nubia with exotic gifts. Come back quickly. Bring the dwarf alive, for the dances of the gods, and for the joy of the palace. The letter is tender, excited, childlike. It is one of the rare moments in Egyptian history where the pharaoh feels human, but time wore that humanity down. Year after year, Egypt frayed. The great bureaucratic machine, expanded under Jedkare and bloated further by Teti, now ran on its own momentum. Governors no longer waited for royal command. They ruled their regions like kings in all but name. Temples answered only to themselves. Priests collected more grain than soldiers. The balance that once held the two lands together broke. Pepi, growing old in his palaces, issued decrees, but they no longer echoed. His officials were loyal in writing, but distant in truth. The further from Memphis one traveled, the less the king mattered. There are no known wars under Pepi II, no great building projects, no expansions of empire, only reports, receipts, sand, and then famine. We don't know exactly when it began, but somewhere in his long, twilight reign, the Nile began to fail. The floods, once the heartbeat of Egypt, came to low, or not at all. Crops withered, markets emptied, the people began to starve, and the king, by now a withered old man, more shadow than ruler, could do nothing. He had become a living monument to stillness, a king who ruled longer than any before him, but could not hold his kingdom together. By the end, the cracks were undeniable. Burials grew rushed and crude, tombs left unfinished. The central government collapsed in all but name. Pepi II died in his 90s. His pyramid, built at Saqqara, is now little more than a hill of crushed stone. His name, once spoken in reverence, became a caution, because his was a reign not marked by violence or cruelty, but by neglect. He ruled too long, and in doing so, he outlived the very structure that made kings divine. The dynasty he left behind would spiral into a vacuum. Civil war, famine, isolation. The old kingdom, that brilliant miracle of stone, faith, and sun, was already dead. Pepi II just hadn't noticed, and so Egypt drifted into a dark unknown, not with screams, but with a long, exhausted sigh. A child had taken the throne, and a ghost had left it. The sand continued to fall. The wind is quiet now, not still, never still in Egypt, but quiet, like breath after grief. The old kingdom has ended. There is no funeral, no final decree, no closing hymn chanted through the columns of a great temple, only the silence of broken things, and the slow descent into darkness. The death of Pepi II did not bring closure, it brought collapse. His sons, if they were sons, ruled for moments, one after the other, names flickering like all lamps in a storm. Merainra II, Neith, Nitocris, Shadow Kings, Ghost Queens, some perhaps never real at all, but fragments of names scribbled in desperation by scribes trying to keep the illusion going. Nitocris, the last name of the 6th dynasty, drips with legend. A queen, perhaps, who rose to power through cunning, who avenged her brother's murder by sealing his assassins inside a banquet hall and drowning them in the Nile's floodwaters. But there is no proof, no tomb, no statue, only stories. And that is what the world becomes now. Stories, because the state is gone, not defeated, simply disassembled. Local rulers, nomarchs, take what's left, each one a king in their own province, each one hoarding grain, gold, loyalty. The temples, once tools of the king, now serve themselves. The rituals continue, but their meaning evaporates. The Nile, once a source of divine rhythm, now turns traitor, flooding too much, or not at all. Famine spreads, tombs are robbed, records burn or are buried, and the people are forgotten. This is not an invasion. There is no enemy army at the gates. Egypt is devouring itself. This era, the one that follows the fall, will later be called the First Intermediate Period, a cold name for a time of hunger, fear, and loss. It is a period of warlords and wandering, of rival cities, of fractured gods. The great pyramids still stand, but now, jackals prowl their shadows. The temples still rise above the earth, but their altars are dust, and the names of kings, once eternal, are wiped from memory like chalk in the wind. But this is not the end of Egypt, because even in the darkness, something stirs. New rulers will rise from the south, from Thebes, from hidden bloodlines, from visions born not of gold but of survival. They will not wear crowns of certainty. They will not speak with the voices of gods, but they will try. And from that trying, a new Egypt will be born. Smaller, harder, more human, but it will remember. It will remember the old names, the broken thrones, the gods who once stood close to men, and then drifted away. It will remember the cruelty, and the silence, and the long shadows of pyramids that no longer point to heaven. And it will begin again, because Egypt does not die. It sinks, and rises. Like the Nile. Like memory. Like breath, held in the chest for far too long. And though the divine kings are gone, their whispers still haunt the sand. They speak in wind-swept ruins. They echo in crumbling temples. They flicker in the dreams of those who still walk the banks of the Nile. So listen, even now, they're still speaking. Thank you for walking with us through the ruins. Through dust and echoes, you've traced the footsteps of kings, some cruel, some forgotten, some barely human. You've stood in the shadows of shattered pyramids, heard the whispered prayers etched in stone, and felt the weight of a world that believed its rulers were gods, until they weren't. If this story moved you, if you felt the wind shift over the Nile, or saw the ghosts flicker behind the veil of time, then don't let the silence swallow it. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next descent into forgotten ages. Leave a comment and tell us which pharaoh haunted you most. Share this story with someone who needs to hear the truth behind the myth. There are more journeys ahead, more voices buried beneath centuries of dust, more shadows waiting to speak. But for now, dim the lights, let the sand settle, and sleep with the weight of history at your side.